Mary Poppins stepped forward and pressed her threepenny bit against the collar of Mrs. Corry's coat. To the surprise of Jane and Michael, it stuck. Then they put theirs on, Jane's on the right shoulder and Michael's on the front hem. Theirs stuck too. How very extraordinary, said Jane. Not at all, my dear, said Mrs. Corry, chuckling. Or rather, not so extraordinary as other things I could mention. And she winked largely at Mary Poppins. I'm afraid we must be off now, Mrs. Corry, said Mary Poppins. There is baked custard for lunch, and I must be home in time to make it. That Mrs. Brill— A poor cook? Inquired Mrs. Corry, interrupting. Poor, said Mary Poppins contemptuously. That's not the word. Ah! Mrs. Corry put her finger alongside her nose and looked very wise. Then she said, Well, my dear Miss Poppins, it has been a very pleasant visit, and I'm sure my girls have enjoyed it as much as I have. She nodded in the direction of her two large, mournful daughters. And you'll come again soon, won't you, with Jane and Michael and the babies? Now, are you sure you can carry the gingerbread? She continued, turning to Michael and Jane. They nodded. Mrs. Corry drew closer to them, with a curious, important, inquisitive look on her face. I wonder, she said dreamily, what you will do with the paper stars. Oh, we'll keep them, said Jane. We always do. Aha! You keep them. And I wonder where you'll keep them. Mrs. Corry's eyes were half closed, and she looked more inquisitive than ever. Well, Jane began, mine are all under my handkerchiefs in the top left-hand drawer, and mine are in a shoebox on the bottom shelf of the wardrobe, said Michael. Top left-hand drawer and shoebox in the wardrobe, said Mrs. Corry thoughtfully, as though she were committing the words to memory. Then she gave Mary Poppins a long look and nodded her head slightly. Mary Poppins nodded slightly in return. It seemed as if some secret had passed between them. Well, said Mrs. Corry brightly, that is very interesting. You don't know how glad I am to know you keep your stars. I shall remember that. You see, I remember everything, even what Guy Fawkes had for dinner every second Sunday. And now, goodbye. Come again soon. Come again soon. Mrs. Corry's voice seemed to be growing fainter and fading away, and presently, without being quite aware of what had happened, Jane and Michael found themselves on the pavement, walking behind Mary Poppins, who was again examining her list. They turned and looked behind them. Why, Jane, said Michael with surprise, it's not there. So I see, said Jane, staring and staring. And they were right. The shop was not there. It had entirely disappeared. How odd, said Jane. Isn't it? Said Michael. But the gingerbread is very good. And they were so busy biting their gingerbread into different shapes, a man, a flower, a teapot, that they quite forgot how very odd it was. They remembered it again that night, however, when the lights were out, and they were both supposed to be sound asleep. Jane, Jane, whispered Michael, I hear someone tiptoeing on the stairs. Listen. Shh, hissed Jane from her bed, for she too had heard the footsteps. Presently the door opened with a little click, and somebody came into the room. It was Mary Poppins, dressed in hat and coat, all ready to go out. She moved about the room softly, with quick, secret movements. Jane and Michael watched her through half-closed eyes without stirring. First she went to the chest of drawers, opened a drawer and shut it again after a moment. Then, on tiptoe, she went to the wardrobe, opened it, bent down and put something in. Or took something out. They couldn't tell which. Snap. The wardrobe door shut quickly, and Mary Poppins hurried from the room. Michael sat up in bed. What was she doing? He said to Jane in a loud whisper. I don't know. Perhaps she's forgotten her gloves or her shoes or... Jane broke off suddenly. Michael, listen. He listened. From down below, in the garden it seemed, they could hear several voices whispering together very earnestly and excitedly. With a quick movement, Jane got out of bed and beckoned Michael. They crept on bare feet to the window and looked down. There, outside in the lane, stood a tiny form and two gigantic figures. Mrs. Corry and Miss Fannie and Miss Annie, said Jane in a whisper. And so indeed it was. It was a curious group. Mrs. Corry was looking through the bars of the gate of number 17. Miss Fannie had two long ladders balanced on one huge shoulder, while Miss Annie appeared to be carrying in one hand a large pail of something that looked like glue, and in the other an enormous paintbrush. From where they stood, hidden by the curtain, Jane and Michael could distinctly hear their voices. She's late, Mrs. Corry was saying crossly and anxiously. Perhaps, Miss Fannie began timidly, settling the ladders more firmly on her shoulder, one of the children is ill, and she couldn't... get away in time," said Miss Annie nervously, completing her sister's sentence. "Silence!" said Miss Corry fiercely, and Jane and Michael distinctly heard her whisper something about great galumping giraffes, and they knew she was referring to her unfortunate daughters. "Hist!" said Mrs. Corry suddenly, listening with her head on one side like a small bird. There was the sound of the front door being quietly opened and shut again, and the creak of footsteps on the path. Mrs. Corry smiled and waved her hand as Mary Poppins came to meet them, carrying a market basket on her arm, and in the basket was something that seemed to give out a faint, mysterious light. Come along, we must hurry. We haven't much time," said Mrs. Corry, taking Mary Poppins by the arm. "Look lively, you two," and she moved off, followed by Miss Fannie and Miss Annie, who were obviously trying to look as lively as possible, but not succeeding very well. They tramped heavily after their mother and Mary Poppins, bending under their loads. Jane and Michael saw all four of them go down Cherry Tree Hill, and then they turned a little to the left and went up the hill. When they got to the top of the hill, where there were no houses but only grass and clover, they stopped. Miss Annie put down her pail of glue, and Miss Fannie swung the ladders from her shoulder and steadied them until both stood in an upright position. Then she held one and Miss Annie the other. "What on earth are they going to do?" said Michael, gaping. But there was no need for Jane to reply, for he could see for himself what was happening. As soon as Miss Fannie and Miss Annie had so fixed the ladders that they seemed to be standing with one end on the earth and the other leaning on the sky, Mrs. Corry picked up her skirts and the paintbrush in one hand and the pail of glue in the other. Then she set her foot on the lowest rung of one of the ladders and began to climb it. Mary Poppins, carrying her basket, climbed the other. Then Jane and Michael saw a most amazing sight. As soon as she arrived at the top of her ladder, Mrs. Corry dipped her brush into the glue and began slapping the sticky substance against the sky. And Mary Poppins, when this had been done, took something shiny from her basket and fixed it to the glue. When she took her hand away, they saw that she was sticking the gingerbread stars to the sky. As each one was placed in position, it began to twinkle furiously, sending out rays of sparkling golden light. "They're ours," said Michael breathlessly. "They're our stars. She thought we were asleep and came in and took them." But Jane was silent. She was watching Mrs. Corry splashing the glue on the sky, and Mary Poppins sticking on the stars, and Miss Fannie and Miss Annie moving the ladders to a new position as the spaces in the sky became filled up. At last it was over. Mary Poppins shook out her basket and showed Mrs. Corry that there was nothing left in it. Then they came down from the ladders, and the procession started down the hill again, Miss Fannie shouldering the ladders, Miss Annie jangling her empty glue pail. At the corner they stood talking for a moment. Then Mary Poppins shook hands with them all and hurried up the lane again. Mrs. Corry, dancing lightly in her elastic-sided boots and holding her skirts daintily with her hands, disappeared in the other direction with her huge daughters stumping noisily behind her. The garden gate clicked. Footsteps creaked on the path. The front door opened and shut with a soft clanging sound. Presently they heard Mary Poppins come quietly up the stairs, tiptoe past the nursery, and go on into the room where she slept with John and Barbara. As the sound of her footsteps died away, Jane and Michael looked at each other. Then, without a word, they went together to the top left-hand drawer and looked. There was nothing there but a pile of Jane's handkerchiefs. "I told you so," said Michael. Next they went to the wardrobe and looked into the shoebox. It was empty. "But how? But why?" said Michael, sitting down on the edge of his bed and staring at Jane. Jane said nothing. She just sat beside him with her arms round her knees and thought and thought and thought. At last she shook back her hair and stretched herself and stood up. "What I want to know," she said, "is this. Are the stars gold paper, or is the gold paper stars?" There was no reply to her question, and she did not expect one. She knew that only somebody very much wiser than Michael could give her the right answer.